To remain updated with the latest business news, click on the bell icon.
Hello and welcome to Business Today. I'm Siddharth Zarabi, and with me today is the Finance Secretary, Dr. T.V. Somanathan, the man behind the budget and perhaps all the major numbers in it. Dr. Somanathan, thank you very much for joining us here on the show. It is, 2 days after the budget, people have had time to digest and dissect many of the numbers. And what I want to do today is to take up some of the issues that have fired the popular imagination and also hopefully take some of the bigger numbers with you. And the first question that I have for you, and I noticed that several people are talking about it, why is there only 5,000 crore rupees provided for the vaccination program for next year?
Sure. The vaccination program is nearing its initial target of full vaccination of 2 doses of the entire adult population. So that is nearing completion. We are now, I think, at 95% for the first dose and above 60% for the second dose. And the funding for that first phase is almost completely accommodated within this year's revised estimates of 39,000 crores. So what is the first phase is fully funded in this year's numbers. What happens beyond that is we have now, of course, the government has opened up vaccination for the third dose to the above 60 and to the frontline workers, and for the initial vaccination to the 15 to 18.
Yes.
The costs of these two are factored into our estimation for next year. Now, what happens beyond that is something that I, as a finance person, don't have visibility on. It is a matter of how the pandemic evolves, what the health policy is, and the funding will follow the policy. So we are funded for what is currently required.
And obviously...
and last year too, we've increased it.
Absolutely.
So it will follow the need. I mean, as the need arises...
You could always take a supplementary allocation for it. But my next question leading from this is, if this is the sort of financial allocation, what is your own assessment and the government's assessment with respect to the COVID impact on the economy? Are we out of the woods? Can we say that FY23 will be the year of growth with the pandemic more or less behind us?
I can tell you my hopes and then I'll separately tell you my expectation. My hope is that it is behind us. That's a hope. But as a serious, planner of finances, one has to also take cognizance of a pessimistic scenario. But even in a pessimistic scenario, and even if there were recurrence of waves of COVID during the year, I think 2 things have changed. One is the level of vaccination in the adult population is becoming very high. I mean, at 2 doses, 60 plus. And soon it will be 90 plus with 2 doses. And regardless of whether it's a new variant, old variant, vaccination is clearly showing up as a preventer of serious illness.
Absolutely.
So that's one positive. The second positive is I think governments and civil society, private sector are learning to cope with COVID. So behavior. So instead of we started with a complete lockdown in the first phase, then we had more moderate lockdowns in the second wave. And in the third wave, we have found that much less of restrictions are being imposed. So I think from the economic point of view, more than COVID, it's the physical response to COVID in terms of closure of schools, closure of cinemas, closure of restaurants, closure of services, closure of markets. This is what has an economic impact. So my sense is even if we were to assume that there would be some recurrence, I think the economic impacts will be much smaller than the earlier waves of COVID.
Dr. Somanathan, is that the reason that the tap, so to say, has nearly been shut when it comes to the additional expenditures that were allocated for the COVID response?
The next year's budget, that is for 22-23, does not provide for any major COVID-related relief expenditure. Yes, that is true. But in the last 2 years, we have demonstrated that if such contingencies arise, we can respond quickly. And so that, of course, remains at the back. But
point fully taken. Yeah. But a lot of post-budget commentary is saying this is an absolutely valid argument. But what about the loss of consumption and the lingering effects of job losses and income losses? People are saying that your budget is not providing for a consumption boost.
Consumption boosts can come directly through infusion of cash to some people, or they may not come. Now, the experience in the West with direct cash transfers is a lot of it was saved. So it's not as if a direct cash transfer results in consumption. Even in India, in the first wave of COVID, we made a massive cash transfer to the Jan Dhan accounts over a period of 3 months. There was a study soon after that which showed that 40% was saved. So it's not as if making a cash transfer results in, it could result in saving as much as
Is the
in
government
consumption.
making an ideological choice after giving money? It's someone's money to spend. Why would the government want to know whether you spent it or saved it?
But you were talking about consumption. I wasn't talking, you spoke about consumption. So I'm asking you, I'm telling you that there is no guarantee that cash infusions result in consumption. They result in income. But whether that income is spent or not is what matters for the economy. On the other hand,
may I interrupt you to say
sure.
that some economists would say that you are trying to evolve a new macro framework because cash in the hands of people is supposed to be a booster in times of slowdown and recessions.
I'm not evolving a new economics. John Maynard Keynes spoke about marginal propensity to save. And if there's a marginal propensity to save is high, then the multiplier effect of cash transfers is low.
Does our economy need spending or saving at this stage?
It needs spending, and that's why we are spending through capital expenditure.
But only the government is doing it. Why not the private sector?
The private sector will have to begin spending when they see the investment opportunities, which is what we are trying to kickstart with our public expenditure.
Dr. Somanathan, and I say this on record, that this government has made numerous attempts to support private investment. Most of those have had results, including the banking thing. I will not go into the details. Why, in your assessment, is private investment not happening to the level that you would yourself have perhaps expected?
There were a few years when we had what is called the twin balance sheet problem, where the banks' balance sheets were bad, the corporate balance sheets were bad. So obviously investment was not happening because banks couldn't lend, corporations couldn't borrow. So that was one phase. As we began to get out of that phase in 1920, we were hit with 2 continuous years of the pandemic. Now, the pandemic and its physical restrictions, I repeat, the biggest influence of the pandemic on the economy, apart from actual lockdowns, is the restrictions on a number of forms of consumer demand. So, demand stimulation, in my view, will come more from the removal of restrictions. If we can go to a cinema, then you can buy some popcorn, which means there's a popcorn supplier who starts supplying it, who engages workers to supply it, who begins to purchase corn to provide the popcorn. Now, if that is closed, that is closed. You can't inject cash and expect that industry to revive. So, removal of restrictions is the prime requirement for demand to restart. Now, if demand restarts now, when balance sheets are in much better shape, banks are in a better position to lend, the capital markets have funds to lend because of lots of funds coming in, we are likely to see a revival of private demand. And
by when, sir?
It's hopefully by the end of this year.
Okay, and to what extent?
I am not an astrologer, and economists are very poor at prediction. So, all I can say is we are creating all the right conditions. We are putting in a strong program of public expenditure on the capital side, which will create productive assets in terms of telecommunications, roads, railways, and widely dispersed state projects with the 1 lakh crore of state capital expenditure loans. So, this should create a very broad base of demand, because capital expenditure creates demand. It leads to payment of wages. It leads to purchase of materials from companies including MSMEs. The MSMEs then spend that money. They engage people. They buy components. They buy raw materials. That kickstarts consumption. That creates the demand through which capital investment by the private sector is likely to build up, because when they see their capacity utilization increasing, they see the need to invest.
I have a follow-up question on consumption, but before that, since you spoke about the impact on certain sectors, how will demand get restored, for example, in the aviation sector? Because almost in parallel at the time when the budget was being presented, there's been a near 10% increase in ATF, and ATF is being treated like a cash cow. Is that fair to the aviation industry, for example?
Let me give you a different perspective on ATF. The taxation on ATF is lower than that on diesel. So ATF is not, all petroleum products are taxed at particular levels. And international oil prices, India imports most of its oil. We cannot insulate any industry from the impact of imported oil prices. So,
Sir, pardon me for interrupting you. Then why are the people being insulated from the price build-up for the last 85 days, OMCs have not raised prices. Why has the daily price movement been suddenly sacrificed, as some people call it, at the altar of political expediency?
I'm sorry, that you'd have to ask the Petroleum Secretary.
Okay, fair point, fair point. But you were making a point about passing on the burden equitably in the fuel prices.
No, what I'm saying is when you say that airfares have gone up, they have gone up because international fuel prices have gone up.
Okay. From a budgetary point of view, how much of a risk have you factored in? Because there are assumptions. Crude oil is at 90. Is there some expectation about how oil is likely to impact the projections for the next financial year?
Oil prices don't directly enter into budget calculations because we don't have any item that is directly related to the oil price. Our excise duties are specific duties. They are not ad valorem duties. So oil price does not directly figure in the budget numbers. Its indirect impact would arise through inflation, what inflation does for various prices, what it does for dearness allowance, things like that.
Which was my next question on consumption. If consumption is going to kickstart, obviously inflation rides along with it. What's your view on how inflation is likely to pan out in the next 4 to 6 quarters?
Again, I think I must start by telling you in a lighter vein that I am yet to meet any economist or analyst who has been successful in predicting even 1 quarter ahead.
Yes.
So I am much less knowledgeable than them. So my predictions are going to be much worse. But what I will say is that we have the tools at hand with which to manage the various international contingencies that may hit us on inflation. So there are possibilities. In fact, currently we have a problem with elevated commodity prices, not just crude oil. It also affects our fertilizer bill.
Absolutely.
It affects a number of other...
In the current financial year.
That's right. So those risks are there, but I think we have the ability to handle them.
That's why you have kind of been conservative. You have prepared the markets and under-promised on certain things, including revenue buoyancy, for example?
Under-promising, not really. I think we have been conservative in estimation. There is a difference between deliberately, underestimating and estimating at a conservative level.
Okay.
So we have taken conservative estimates. We have anticipated not the most optimistic scenario. We've taken something which we consider a more realistic scenario, given the different risks that are prevalent.
Which is very credible because the maths of the budget is ultimately tested. Just one point. Is the cleanup of the economy that began several years ago, and it's not just a budgetary exercise, I'm asking you a broader question, is that over? There were many poison pills scattered around and they kept popping up. Is that now behind us?
I think to a very large extent it is behind us.
Dr. Somanathan, Air India has been cleaned up. And I will also ask you about some social sector spending priorities, but the question is, why is Bharat Sanchar still being fed?
Last year, the government announced a public sector enterprise policy. This policy, if you like, was an inversion of the 1950s commanding heights public sector policy, because it said that the government would divide the public sector into 2 categories, strategic and non-strategic. The policy stated that in the strategic sectors, the government would continue to have a presence, but with a minimum number of public undertakings. And in the non-strategic sectors, the government would vacate those sectors by eventually privatizing all the public enterprises in those sectors. Telecommunications is a strategic sector. It is therefore, it is the policy of the government that there will always be one public sector undertaking in the telecommunications sector. So this is not one where the eventual goal is privatization. The eventual goal here is a minimal presence. That minimal presence exists for 2 reasons. One, to protect consumers so that if there are monopolistic or non-competitive tendencies in an industry, you have at least one alternative which is not subject to that. And secondly, there are issues of reach to remote areas, to villages. It is not as if our private sector has actually reached there are many parts of India where the only the signal that you'll get is BSNL.
Absolutely.
So BSNL will continue into the future.
That's a good point that you make, sir, and you're absolutely right that the private sector has not reached there. But why isn't Bharat Broadband able to meet many of the targets? And they've been, outlined year upon year.
That's an issue of execution, and I'm sure the government will improve upon that this year. Substantial provisions have been made and course corrections have been done, and I think it is on course to complete its targets this year. Whatever they have for this year, I think they will do.
I also want to request you to take our viewers through the philosophy of the cleanup, and those are my words, as far as social sector spending is concerned, including some of the numbers which have been kept at lower levels than the enhanced spending. The question I'm asking you is, Narega, for example, beyond the numbers, there have been reports, perhaps you're aware of that, about substantial leakages in a particular state or two. Have you had occasion to look through it? Is it a matter of concern? Is there a change in strategy needed?
The leakages in Narega are a matter of serious concern, and we have taken cognizance of those reports, and subsequent anecdotal accounts from other states indicate that those reports are not peculiar to one state, and in fact are more widespread. So yes, that is one area of attention which I'm sure the Ministry of Rural Development will be looking at very carefully in terms of tightening systems and making sure that what is spent reaches those whom it is intended to reach. That's one area. In terms of budget provisioning, we have provided the same level as last year's budget. It is a demand-driven scheme, and we remain committed to funding it as the demand arises. But it is our expectation that with large increases in spending on other programs, including the PM Gram Sadak Yojana,
Yes,
where we had a huge step up this year, 27% increase. We've also made provision for meeting part of the state's share of PM Gram Sadak Yojana. So it's our expectation that with the pandemic receding, with no major lockdowns, with limited restrictions, without the kind of out-migration that you saw from big cities 2 years ago, it is unlikely that there will be a major surge in Narega demand compared to the last 2 years.
Take our viewers through the Jal Shakti allocation, but not just the allocation. What's your own sense about how it is panning out on the ground and the outcomes from previous allocations?
So for the Jal Jeevan mission specifically, which is a tap in every house, the allocation this year 60,000 crores, the highest ever, and they expect to complete 3.8 crore tap connections. They've made substantial progress in the last 2 years, but the biggest years in terms of outputs are this year and next year. So I think they are on course to get the job done.
Okay, I now want to, in the last couple of questions during our conversation, I want you to talk about the broader numbers. I'm reading from commentary and I want to get this right. Why did you not opt for a reduction of the fiscal deficit in the current financial year? I've read through reports which say that you had headroom. Why didn't you do that and sort of positively surprise the market?
See, let me put it this way, we do not construct our estimates we are not a kind of company which tries to meet analysts' estimates. Okay. So we don't try to positively surprise our analysts. I mean, it is for the analysts to analyze what they analyze, and we may or may not meet their consensus estimates, and that doesn't drive our decision making. So I think a lot of people those who are predicting our numbers, and for some of whom it is a profession to predict our numbers, I think we're looking at the revenue side, and they're absolutely right on the revenue side. But there were two numbers which were perhaps not too widely understood. One is that the disinvestment number is not 1.75 lakh crores. Now we are down by about 1 lakh crores there. Now that I think was anticipated. But there's also on the expenditure side this belief that the money will somehow not get spent. Now that I think people have forgotten. There are huge increases this year because of the COVID relief packages. So 1 lakh crore for food. Then there's the fertilizer subsidy increase from 79 to 140, and it may go up further.
Absolutely.
Even this year. So that's a huge amount. And then we had 22,000 crores was added because of COVID in the health sector. If you add all of these up, they are pretty substantial. So the effect of the numbers that we are showing is the best estimates that we have as of the time that these numbers are done. But it's a very dynamic situation. It's possible that, then there is the other problem with government budgeting, that if a department says, I can actually spend so much on productive capital investment, please give it to me. I may have my doubts, but if I tell them that I don't give it, then it will not happen. Right. If I give it, it may happen. If I restrict it, then it will definitely not happen.
And you also have a further challenge since you spoke about companies. Companies give their numbers after the quarter is over.
Exactly.
You have 2 months before.
So it is, we have done the best job we can to come up with the most realistic numbers that will not result in negative revision after the event.
Okay, point taken. And one final question really, and I'm quoting this from India Ratings report. The National Statistical Organization's periodic labor force for FY20 released in July 2021 showed a rise in the share of labor force in agriculture despite policy objectives of moving them out of agriculture.
This is for 2021 years.
Yeah. Real wages in rural areas have turned negative across all agriculture and non-agriculture operations so far in FY22. The question asked in the report, and I'm paraphrasing it, is it not perplexing, particularly when a disturbing trend and distress is building up in rural India, that some of the spending seems to have been tightened?
So I think the years on which this report appears, I have not seen the report.
Okay.
But I'm sure you're reading it correctly. I'm not disputing that. But I would say that the years you're referring to are the years when the whole world has been subject to distress. India has not been an exception. So to choose 2021 and 21-22 and say that there is distress, I admit that. I am unhappy about it. But it is not something that governments in any country have been able to prevent. It's a difference of degree between one polity and another. So on the larger question of what is to be done in agriculture, the government remains committed to improving the incomes of farmers. The MSP program remains very strong. It's fully funded. Record levels of grain procurement are being done. And the MSP is being extended beyond the narrow range of 2 or 3 North Indian states. Recently, like just this morning, I had somebody from Assam telling me that for the first time, MSP procurement has been very successfully done in Assam. Now, this is the way the government is moving, and there are adequate monies provided to back all the farmer programs. The PM Kisan program has finally reached some states where the state had decided not to use it earlier. So that is being done, and the agriculture budget is up. Now, there is a portion of the distress, particularly 2021, is affected by the migration that happened. It is affected by this peculiar circumstances of that year. I wouldn't draw a trend based on that, nor would I minimize the issue of improving agricultural incomes. It is a long-term thing, and we are working on it, and we are very committed to improving agricultural incomes.
One quick final comment about this whole broader debate about the haves becoming better off and those who are at the bottom end suffering, and this bit about the inequality. Do you agree with that, particularly in the context of rural stress?
I have not seen very credible data on this. I am not disputing it, but I would say that this is more anecdotal and perception. It is absolutely true that people who invest in stock markets have done very well, and that they are mostly the rich. So I think that is absolutely true. Perhaps there is a case for for them to pay more taxes, but the government has chosen to stick with its stable tax policy. But in terms of is it worsening, I have not yet seen very clear data that would prove it one way or the other. But we remain very conscious of the need to protect the poor. And protecting the poor is something that the government has paid a lot of attention to throughout the pandemic, both in terms of food support, income support. Sorry?
No, you spared the stock markets but gave the stick to crypto investors.
Yes, I think crypto investments are going to be taxed. Yes, that's right.
But Dr. Somanathan, I know I'm stretching this, but I'll try and keep this as the very last question. The doors have been kept open, the windows have been kept open, there is no boundary wall surrounding this garden. 40 odd platforms are providing crypto services. People have entered it in the absence of a regulatory regime. The government has not yet framed a law. The common man is not responsible for that. They elect lawmakers. Yet a punitive kind of taxation is done. It is treated like gambling. Is it fair to do it in this manner? Why not a law first, regulation, and then a stable regulatory taxation regime, sir?
No, I think the Income Tax Act doesn't exempt any kind of income except agricultural income. Income from crypto has been taxable even before this law. It is taxable today, and it will remain taxable after April 1st. What is changing is the regime of taxation. So it is taxable even before April the 1st, but not at 30%. It is taxable based on the classification of that income either as business income or as capital gain. It fits into different chapters of the Income Tax Act and with appropriate rates. That is a bit confusing because it creates a lot of uncertainty, potential for disputes. So all that is being changed and clarity in taxation is coming in from April the 1st. But it is taxable even today. Let me be very clear. So if anybody thinks that because nothing is exempt from taxation because it's unregulated. So if you speculate on horse races, it is taxable. We don't have a horse race regulatory authority of India, but it is still taxable. So everything is taxable unless it is exempted, and only agriculture is completely exempted. So it is taxable, and it is not necessary that something should be regulated. And there are many spaces. There is a space of legal regulated. There is a space of legal unregulated. And then there is a space of illegal. So crypto is not in the illegal space. It is not yet in the legal and regulated space. It is in the space of legal and unregulated. But legal and unregulated is taxable. Even illegal is taxable. So if an IAS officer takes a bribe, that is taxable.
Absolutely.
It's illegal.
Absolutely.
But crypto is not illegal. Crypto is legal, unregulated, taxable.
I'll let that be the final word. And viewers, if you've seen this, you will realize that's why Dr. T.V. Somanathan is the man behind this budget and many more in the future. Dr. Somanathan, as always, thank you very much for your time. It's been brilliant to have this conversation. I know we could have carried it on, but time comes in between. Thanks once again for sparing your time. With that, it's a wrap on this conversation. If you've been, thank you very much for watching.
If you like the video, do like, comment, share and subscribe.